Okay, this week we're going to cover the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire. We like to call it from the Principate to the Dominate, the crisis of the 3rd century AD. There were hints of trouble, impending trouble, already in the Antonine era, but sort of the whole thing sort of exploded at the end of the Severan dynasty. But let's just look at some of the things. What we're going to do in this lecture is kind of present an outline. In the next lecture, we'll look at some details to it. What do we mean by the general trends and all? Some people point to the plague that struck Rome between 165 and 180 AD, known as the Antonine Plague, as maybe the beginning of the Troubles. The sources say that a quarter of the population at Rome died. They're not sure if it was probably smallpox. And that it spread to the armies on the limes and had devastating impact. And we'll talk about this when we talk about emperors, for example. We can't really assess it. It's clear there was population decline. Okay. Then with the reign of Commodus, we have another case of an emperor who was basically unfit to rule, and when he died, when he was murdered, it led to widespread civil wars. Ultimately, Lucius Septimius Severus was able to galvanize and reorganize the empire, but it was a tremendous cost, and also we should point out that he represents a new kind of leader. He was not a member of the senatorial elite at all. He was a soldier risen from the ranks, and so we end up with this new emerging sort of military dictatorship, the gradual elimination of senatorial hierarchy in the military. After the Severan dynasty, he and his two sons, the last being Caracalla, it set in motion widespread chaos in the empire. We have the reign of the Barracks emperors from 235 to 284 AD. Some 24 emperors reigned in 50 years. The two longest reigns, one being Aurelian, were of 7 and 8 years only. So this is really what starts to bring it down. Just a long series of civil wars. This was finally brought to a close with the reign of Diocletian, who was able to organize the empire. He reigned Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus. Again, maybe someone of some rank, but rose from the military, from a Greek heritage and military once again. He reigned from 284 to 305. He tried to reorganize, at least in his reign, we have all of the empire under one hand. He tried to organize it in an effective manner so that it could be governed down the road. Primarily, he tried to create a tetrarchy, dividing the empire into 4 prefectures: the East, the Oriens, Illyricum, Italia, and Gallia. But unfortunately, in the process of transition, of making the decisions, moving up, it all broke down again, and we have more civil wars. Ultimately, Constantine was able to prevail and become the one great emperor of Rome, 306 to 337 AD. And at that point, we go into the 4th century. We'll talk about things after this, but there's the general outline. Constantine was able to sort of reorganize things again. But what's constant here? The constant need to reorganize, the constant need for civil wars, the threats from the exterior, and the enormous burden that this put on the Roman population. So what were the nature of the threats? People always point to this. We have the Germanic invasions, the pressure mounting on the limes by Germanic tribes. One of our problems is it's hard to get a handle on this because the names of the tribes change over time. They kind of amalgamate one into another. But these are hybrid populations. But what we know is that for some reason there was increasing pressure of these Germanic peoples on the limes. One theory is that they had a natural migration pattern from the Baltic down to the Mediterranean. You think of the invasion of the Teutons in the Cimbri in 105 BC. The Roman Republic had to deal with this. Is what made Marius such a great general. And that maybe the limes, this permanent barrier, actually interrupted and prevented what would have been a natural sort of migratory pattern. just mounting pressure on the borders as a result. So there's one problem, and this is not going to go away. The main tribes that start to emerge are at this era are the Goths, particularly the Visigoths in the east, but also the Vandals and the Burgundians in that way. I should point out that under the Antonites, German invasions did break through the Limes and got all the way to the Mediterranean, all the way to Trieste under Marcus Aurelius, for example. So it's not like the threat was unknown in that regard. The new threat were the Sassanid Persians, the Parthian Empire. The Romans had successfully kind of dueled with them for centuries, and it kind of prevented them from becoming an inordinate threat. Ultimately, they collapsed from within and were replaced by a new Persian dynasty known as the Sassanids, and they became a very viable threat for the next 4 centuries. And then third thing is that, in sometimes some areas internally, as control from the center began to fall apart, breakaways started to occur. Once again, we hear about this peasant rebellion in Gaul called the Bagaudae, spread from Gaul all the way down to the provinces in Spain. So this area had never really become fully Romanized, and we're taking an opportunity here. We also have Zenobia of Palmyra. So here's just a view of a map of the Sassanid Persian Empire at its peak. You can see that it basically mimicked in many ways the ancient Persian Empire, and at its peak under Shapur I actually conquered Egypt and Syrio-Palestine and a large swath of Anatolia, controlling territory all the way to the border of China. Perhaps its most famous image is the rock relief at I thought I had it here. Rushta-e-Rushtam. There it is, Nox-e-Rushtam. And we see the emperors, the Roman emperors, defeated at the Battle of Edessa in 253 AD, surrendering, bowing and asking for mercy. Valerian and Philip the Arab surrendering to the Sassanid Emperor Shapur I. The Sassanids conquered, as I said, much of Anatolia, and this border wars between the Romans and the Sassanid Persians is going to be a constant menace. And in fact, the plague that got to Rome in 165 may have been brought back by Roman troops that were fighting in Mesopotamia at that time. We mentioned the peasant revolts. The other thing is, just as an example, but here we have Queen Zenobia of Palmyra. From about 270 AD, she broke away from the Roman Empire. She may have been a local sort of princess. Her husband was a leading figure of Palmyra. Palmyra is the desert site in Syria, this very, very affluent trading community in charge, a major hub for the interchange with the luxury trade from the East and the Roman Empire. I meant to add a slide showing its stellar colonnaded streets. This is the site that was heavily destroyed by ISIS during the recent conflict this way. She not only broke away, this is, again, one of these marcher regions. We saw this before with Herod II in Judea and Antiochus IV of Commagene, and how they sort of kind of played the Parthians off the Romans in a bid to make their own situation better. She succeeded where they had failed. She actually was able to break away and then take over for a couple of years a large portion of the eastern part of the Roman Empire this way. And so, again, breakaway components are yet another reflection of the fact that the power at the center was weakening and people were finding alternative solutions. And we mentioned the Germans already. 2 types of peoples that we see at this time. We see the Sarmatians. These are basically Iranian peoples, Scythians that came from the steppes north of the Black Sea and became a constant menace. And we also have the Goths, which were East Germans by the mid-2nd century AD. Both of these elements were sort of moving into the region of the Danube, so that becomes a major critical focal point for the defense of the empire. So think about that for a second. Think about the fact that the Sassanid Persians are out there coming in from Mesopotamia into Syria from the east, and that the Goths and the Sarmatians were attacking from the Danube. And you see that that corner of the empire was suddenly the flashpoint, the chief strategic point for defense of the empire. And the emperors had to think in these terms and mobilize forces effectively in that corner. Some other points we could make. Why were there so many civil wars? There never had been an effective means of succession determined for the empire. During the Antonines, the senatorial aristocracy and the military hierarchy had come to kind of an agreement that they would sort of combine, select the leadership. Each successive emperor had to adopt his successor, had to be approved. The only wrinkle there was Hadrian. The Senate didn't like him, but that was too bad for them. But with the end of the Antonine reign, it breaks down completely, and there is a definite antagonism of the military class, and we'll explain that in the next lecture, against the senatorial aristocracy. And their solution was simply to bypass it. But that means the military class now gets to determine who will be the next emperors to a large degree. So we're looking at a military dictatorship. Again, from 235 to 284, during those 50 years, more than 35 different people bid to become the Roman emperor. They didn't all successfully become recognized as emperor, but it's chaos at this point. And people like to say the civil wars were the main thing. Maybe the other threats could have been handled if Rome could have figured out a way to legitimately transfer power from one dynasty or one reign to the next this way. But nonetheless, warfare became the order, and you have to have large, successful armies. Another feature to all of this was the rising cost of this. So what we see, according to the coinage, is inflation, that they began to strike less pure coins to cover their cost. We'll have a talk about that with the price edict of Diocletian. But all of this led to sort of a more intricate application of military rule by trying to get the necessary resources for the army, if necessary, in kind rather than through cash, for example, while saving the cash to pay the troops themselves. But so even the economic system starts to become more of a command economy as opposed to a market economy, if we think of it in broadest terms that way. And the breakdown in the governmental administration. In the wake of the political and economic chaos, many local governmental officials began to abandon their administrative duties. If it's really bad and people are pointing at you to deal with it, then maybe you don't want to be a decurion anymore, and you have to figure out a solution to that in that way. For example, the urban tax collecting officials, the decuriales, were personally made responsible for collecting the towns or areas tax liability. And if they couldn't make that amount, they had to make up for the shortfall from their own resources. And you can only do this so long before you endanger the livelihood of the elite itself. And in the chaos of the 3rd century, urban nobles increasingly tried to evade the position of decurion or decaproton. To escape this debilitating tax demand. Traditional explanations for the collapse of the Roman Empire. And this is the standard explanation. Now we're going to look at it this way, and then at the end of the semester we're going to look at another way, my view of what I call resilience theory. But the standard view is that, first of all, civil wars, the mounting civil wars, ultimately doubled the size of the military. And secondly, the fact that there was no systematic, recognized, acceptable means of succession meant that succession was a matter of the strongest. So leads to the civil wars in that way. And all this is going on while there was mounting barbarian pressure on the limes. So that's point number 3. And then finally, you take all of this and its chaos, it's a rising burden of the military establishment imposed on a civilian population in an agricultural economy which could barely sustain in the past something like massive earthquakes or any kind of major confrontation, would be really taxing the resources of the empire. So putting all this together, and there's just not much of a future. What the Romans did was impose a military dictatorship, I would say, in two regards. It's interesting to note that it did sustain the duration of the empire for a good couple of hundred years, depending on what you want to call where did the empire, when is it officially over? That's debatable itself. Traditionally, we date it to 476. So let's say from 234 to 476, well, that's a good 200 years still. And they did this partly by sustaining the large urban populations too, to a large degree. I like to say it wasn't a collapse, it was more of a slow burn. The lights go out one by one in a way. But they understood that their principal resource was manpower, and so one of the big urgent needs is how do we maintain our population in an era of chaos? How do we maintain the infrastructure? How do we make it possible for people to be in big cities and still get food from the outside, and questions like this? And so this is what we see the hierarchy doing, manipulating the supply chain, sound familiar, to make sure that they can sustain it. And to some degree, we have to recognize their success in that regard.